In order to contextualize this scientific work around climate, it is important to first understand current philosophical thought about human relationships to the non-human world. We will begin by asking the question, how ought humans approach their relationship with the non-human world? Which is more ethically conscious, to think about the environment as a giant system, a classical holistic view, or to care for individual organisms?
We will then transition to the question of why we should value the non-human world. Do non-human entities have intrinsic value, or are they valuable insofar as they are useful to humans? Is this dichotomy even useful, or is it too narrow-minded to encompass the complex relationships between humans and their environment? Elise Springer and Lori Gruen of the Philosophy Department will weigh in.
There are ways of approaching environmental ethics from a deeply consequentialist direction, on which what matters is the outcomes as far as we can conceive them, and then our obligation really is to something as vast as the whole world, insofar as we can affect it. And so we think of moral concern as extending to all living beings, or all the sentient beings that are precariously living within this sphere of the Earth's environment. Or we might, on the other hand, look at the word environment and question whether a "the" can go before it, because we all have different environments, right? Environment suggests surroundings, and humans each live in surroundings that are both human and non-human. And we might begin with, how do I relate to my environment? In what sense do I think of myself as having obligations in virtue of what's local to me, or what is within reach, right? I take it that we're struggling to find a way in which we can have the concrete connectedness that begins with a place, and yet not lose sight of the horizon as a never clear boundary. Right? In a way, what I'm suggesting is exactly that. I think those two alternatives force us to choose in a way that has regrettable consequences. So if we think individualistically, sort of think of the set of all organisms sort of as if they were suspended out in space and not connected to each other, and we weren't located within that set. And if we think holistically, we sort of think that there's one single super entity, and that's what matters. If we think instead relationally, then we have something more like a network or a situated relationship.
That's what we value, intrinsic capacities. Well, what other intrinsic capacities should we value? Oh, well, here we have sentience, and here we have life, and here we have that. But what you notice what that's doing is it's extensionist. It's an extensionist way of thinking about, and and again, this is what many of the holists in environmental thought have argued. It also makes it the case that what we're valuing is an intrinsic property that exists within this individual organism. And what many have argued is that, many environmentalists have argued, what we need to value is wholes. So Aldo Leopold and the holists would argue that we need to value the whole ecological community. Feminists have argued it's not really intrinsic properties but relations that we should value. So this is part of why I think that the intrinsic value, instrumental value debate is wrong-headed. I think there are important insights about value that we get when we think about instrumental value versus intrinsic value. So I'm not suggesting that we do away with that. I also think that there's important insights to individualism versus communitarianism or holism on both sides that are really important, both within environmental ethics and within political philosophy more broadly. But I do think it misses the relationality and the context.
Because the rhetoric about intrinsic value, as much as I admire it, invokes a separateness. That is, it has nothing to do with me. It's valuable in itself. And in that gesture, we lose track of the ways in which we're connected to it. right? If we need to frame the question in terms of separateness from me. And so what I'm hoping to animate in my own work in ethics is a focus on value neither as residing in the thing in itself, nor in what it can do for me, but in forms of engagement. And then we ask, how best are relationships inhabited, right, between me and other things without drawing a clear boundary and locating value on one or the other side? We miss the complexity of the reality if we think about the inherent value of the entities in a way that kind of seals value into things. Right?
The philosophical underpinnings described here play out in the political realm, albeit subconsciously. How do faculty feel about the current political discourse around climate?
Yes, I'm a true believer. I've been a true believer that humans are impacting climate change, since the mid-late 80s. So certainly when I arrived at Wesleyan, I arrived here in 1989, I was already concerned about climate change and how humans were impacting it and what we could do about it. Well, I think the IPCC does an excellent amount of work. I think bringing all these people together to compile climate data, to discuss what is happening, what will happen, and how can we make use of the data, how can we collectively look at ways to adapt to the climate change or mitigate the climate change. And I think that's really important. I think it's fairly conservative in its projections. Climate changes so fast. I mean, you almost can't keep up with the new data and research and the number of people doing research. It's really staggering. So I am a fan of what they do, but in the context that they're conservative.
The IPCC document is solid. I think it's a good piece of work. I mean, it's a consensus. There's no original information in these documents. Because it's a consensus document, what that means is that all 100 and whatever number of countries that are signed on, part of the UN, have to agree with every single word in that document. And so what that means is it becomes sort of the lowest common denominator statement. It becomes more conservative than the mean expectation or the mean interpretation. The future reality is a little more dire than what's said in those IPCC documents.
I think that climate change is the issue of our day, and there's just no doubt about it. And that almost everything we do affects climate, and that we really have to figure out how to live in a more equitable and just way and have lower impact on the environment, and it means we're going to have to sacrifice, mostly here in the developed world, because I believe that it's not the picture of total emissions, it's the use by individuals, and that's partly justice. In other words, it's hard for me to understand why the United States should have a position where we would demand that people in other parts of the world just have less of a right to emit things, and we have more of a right to pollute the atmosphere to a greater extent, and that to me doesn't equate very well. And yet we know that if people in China or India were to express themselves via pollution of carbon dioxide the way we express ourselves in the United States on a per capita basis, that it would be a disaster for the climate. One of the great things about Wesleyan and its students, and why I found this position here so attractive, is that we have the ability to create the solutions, and that we can't just that solutions are going to have to be integrative. We're going to have to look at steps. There's not going to be a silver bullet by which we can change just tomorrow what we do, but we have to start changing. And so we have to find a way, and we have to start challenging the things that we're used to having as our norms. Is it is it critical? Can we have, like asking the question, do we really have to have an economy that's based on growth?
So when environmental activists find themselves pitted against ideological or political forces and conceive that relationship oppositionally, I think that they undermine their chances of really putting into practice and constructively moving forward with the goals of allowing interdependent interests and processes to coexist and actually learn from one another. Because in fact, environmental concerns, as I understand them, they can be narrowly understood in terms of interest in climate change and so forth, but in a sense, if we really appreciate environment or ecology as interdependence with surroundings, all of the concerns that surround us are part of our environment. And the question is, with the threads of concern that are different from something like climate change, so threads of concern about economic prosperity, for example, we need to think more about redirecting than about squashing or overcoming, right? At least in the long term. Okay. On the other hand, I think that there are some concepts and forces at work politically that are close enough to exactly opposed to environmental concerns that that mobilizing against them has some value in context. Right? So, in particular, the notion of a corporation as a profit seeker rather than a participant in interaction that ought to be held to account in the same way that we hold human beings to account for the consequences of their patterns of action, right? It's vital, I think, that insofar as we recognize corporations at all, we have to recognize them with the full scope of responsibilities that we attach to ourselves.
I mean, are there other solutions to economic and personal prosperity that don't depend on growth? And we may not like the answers. It may not be easy to get to those answers, but it's very hard to see how you can have how we can have sustainability while the economic engines have to continue to grow. It's going to be hard, but there are alternative economic plans that are out there. To me, the real issue is going to be how to deal with the fact that publicly traded corporations, which have the contract that they must maximize the return on their investments to stockholders, that is at odds with managing natural resources. So the only reason that we're seeing, for example, oceanic fisheries continuing at all is because of subsidies. It's an industry that's been overcapitalized, and we're seeing diminishing resources. That, first of all, I think oil is too cheap, that we really should be up in the $6 to $7 a gallon range for gasoline in the United States, and that would start fixing a lot of issues right there. Although the hardship on a lot of people in the short run will be huge, and particularly to poor people, and that's something that I haven't entirely worked out. There's enough foreign oil, regardless of our dependence on it, that could fuel us into the conversion away from oil entirely